Have you ever wondered what the top 5 geopolitical risks impacting the energy markets are? Well, Professor Jason Bordoff, founding director on the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University, is here to give you the answers now.
So thank you so much for joining, Jason Bordoff, and for participating in the Digital ONS 2020, joining us in from New York. We challenged you and are looking forward to you sharing your views on the top 5 geopolitical risks on energy markets. So please, Jason.
Well, it's hard to know where to start. There are so many geopolitical risks that are important to energy markets in this very unusual year of a historic pandemic. I'll mention a couple. I think I would mention obviously the U.S. election in November is going to be very important and going to take U.S. policy, both its domestic climate policy and importantly its foreign policy, in quite different directions. So that is going to have important implications in many respects for global energy markets. One of those is going to be the very sharp difference between the Trump administration and the Biden administration on its sanctions policy, and particularly its policy toward Iran. So Vice President Biden has committed to rejoin the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. The consequence of that would be somewhere around 1.5 million or 2 million barrels of Iranian crude coming back into an already oversupplied market. I think Vice President Biden has also indicated that he might use sanctions in other respects too, potentially further sanctions being taken against Russia. That could also impact the energy sector. So U.S. elections, Iran, beyond Iran, just the Gulf region as a whole. I think with the recent deal and normalization of relations between Israel and the UAE, recent political instability or concerns about political instability and electricity and power outages in Iraq. I think one might be worried about the political situation in Iraq, about continued energy supply in the region. There is a frightening frequency with which things are accidentally exploding in Iran. And I think it's a worrisome situation about whether these sort of provocations might escalate and whether there might be some broader tensions in the region that flare up as a result. So the Gulf region would be another geopolitical risk I would point to. I'm not going in any particular order because perhaps the top geopolitical risk is the U.S.-China relationship, and not just U.S.-China, but China and several other countries in Europe, what's happening in China, what's happening in Hong Kong, and what is really becoming a deeply strained relationship between the U.S. and China that I think is going to continue regardless of who wins the election here in the United States in November. And so that has the potential to also escalate in different ways, hopefully not in a kinetic military way, but potentially through cybersecurity or at a minimum, just much more difficult relations between the two that could have impacts on energy markets, on energy demand, on economic growth. I threw in there one thing that I think is a standalone geopolitical risk of its own, and maybe that's the final one, which is cybersecurity. I think cybersecurity is a very important and growing threat. We see numerous actors around the world that continue to try to elevate their cybersecurity capability, and I think that continues to be, has been for a while, but continues to be a growing concern. You asked for 5. I think that was 5, but I would just mention also I haven't said anything about Latin America, Venezuela, some of the other fragile states that are very important to global energy, particularly global oil markets, like Venezuela, like Libya. I think those will also be important parts of the world to watch in 2021.
So in what ways do you expect the global energy market to look differently coming out of this situation?
Well, I think things are going to look different for quite a while. Clearly, this is a historic, once in a century kind of horrible pandemic. And we don't exactly know how it's going to look different, but we know energy demand has taken an enormous hit, and oil demand will be down around 8 or 9% this year. I don't expect oil demand will recover to its pre-COVID levels probably until 2022. Certain types might get a little bit of a boost. We see in certain very crowded urban areas. I'm in New York City, where I think people are inclined to drive in private transportation if they have it rather than in mass transit. And we see that pattern continuing in other urban areas like Beijing as well. There's actually been a boost in private vehicle ownership and driving. So that, could be one area where you actually boost gasoline demand a little bit. But I think on the whole, it's going to demonstrate far more weakness on things that will persist for a while. Jet fuel and aviation is the most obvious one. And that's connected to the fact that I think we are going to see, to some degree, perhaps not as great as some people think, but we are going to see some degree of permanent changes in the way business is conducted and the way people operate and convene globally that will also have a negative impact on oil demand. So I don't think we've seen peak oil demand yet. I think it will continue to grow, but perhaps at a slower rate than one might have expected before the pandemic. I think the other thing that's quite important is to think about efforts around climate change, around the energy transition, and how the pandemic could affect those. It's not so much the near-term fact that carbon emissions went down sharply this year, because that is near-term and that will recover as economic growth and energy use recover. If anything, the fact that we put more than 4 billion people around the world under lockdown and oil demand only declined 25% at its peak was a sort of sobering reminder of how difficult it is to move the world off of oil and to decarbonize. But I think it's the policy response, and maybe I'm talking my own book since I spend all my time thinking about policy and run a policy center, but I think policy is important. And the question is, how does policy respond to this pandemic? And there are some things that could accelerate the transition, like major efforts to take stimulus packages, economic stimulus packages, and focus on green priorities the way Europe and Brussels has. But there's the possibility, which I worry actually more about, of going in the other direction because of a very significant focus on economic growth and a concern about the outlook for economic growth, that the ambition around climate might actually wane a little bit. And we see that in a place like China, which has very much focused its economic recovery efforts on carbon-heavy industries, where they see the opportunity for a lot of economic activity and growth. So I think the thing to watch is how policy responds to this, and I think it'll cut in both directions. But I'm actually worried that the overarching concern with the state of the economy might cause the ambition of climate policy to be ratcheted back.
Thank you. And in terms of the energy industry, what do you consider to be the biggest challenges that they are faced with now?
Well, 2020 is a historic year for energy markets and a deeply challenging one. We're seeing some of the worst quarterly results reported in history. We're seeing large cutbacks in investment. We're seeing more pressure being placed, certainly in the US shale patch at least, pressure from not just ESG pressures, environment, social and governance pressures, but also pressures to show more profitability and return. So all of these are weighing heavily on the industry at a time when oil prices, they have recovered in sort of this $45, $50 range where I think they'll probably be for a while. But even that is a tough place to be for many companies in the oil industry, and certainly for many states, governments that depend heavily on oil revenue in the Gulf. Saudi Arabia is one example of a country that has the sovereign wealth reserves to weather this storm for a while, but oil prices in this range are painful, forcing budget cuts, forcing belt tightening, forcing it to draw down on its reserves, and that can only continue for so long.
Thank you. And to round off on a positive thing, where do you see the greatest opportunities lie for the energy industry?
Well, I think the greatest opportunities for the energy industry are trying to think differently about the energy transition. One thing that has been striking to me, notwithstanding COVID-19, is whether it's among environmental activists or the private sector or investors, the rising ESG pressures, the rising concerns about making sure that we constructively move toward a decarbonized future are continuing. And I think those pressures on industry will continue. We see that with financial institutions. You even see some of the largest energy companies, Equinor in ONS's backyard being just one that have doubled down on their commitments to net zero energy system by 2050. And so we have seen battery and solar costs fall 85% in the last decade. We've seen onshore wind costs fall 50% in the last decade. The economic opportunity to invest and grow those businesses and actually find ways that make economic sense as well as environmental sense to move in a lower carbon direction moving forward are pretty exciting. And I think that's something that's attracting more and more recognition, including from the oil industry itself.
So we may see this speed up the energy transition, actually.
Well, as I said a moment ago, it really depends on how policy responds to that. So I think commercial forces could certainly make that happen. I just worry a little bit if policy becomes less ambitious as a result. So we just have to make sure that doesn't happen.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Jason. Very interesting perspectives as always.
Thank you.